This is Why Commodities with James Cordier. Hola, I'm Joe Partavila, and we are exploring the amazing world of commodities with James Cordier. James, how are you, sir?
I'm doing well today, Joe. How about you?
I'm doing incredibly well, and I'm super excited for today's episode because we've got someone lined up who you are pretty much, for lack of a better word, you're a fanboy of this person. You are a big fan of Judy Ganes. Can you tell us why?
I've been a fan of Judy's for going on 25 or 26 years. In the late 90s, I was just discovering the coffee, cocoa, and sugar market, and we'll throw OJ in there as well. And while you're learning how to trade and learning these different markets, you're also looking at what other colleagues are in the industry. And this Judy Ganes from Merrill Lynch was just being quoted all the time. And I'm reading some of the materials that she had put out, and it's like, this girl really knows her stuff. And I don't know, 1997, 1998, I reached out to a reporter friend of mine at Reuters. I said, this Judy Ganes, how do you get a hold of her? How can you possibly do that? He said, well, I don't have her number, but you might look her up in the phone book. And believe it or not, a couple of days later, I called her office. A couple transfers later, Judy and I actually got on the phone, and we've been working together similar to this ever since.
That's pretty cool. And Judy Ganes is legit. She's a globally known, renowned commodities and future analyst who leverages her deep expertise in food and agricultural industries to provide unique market insights through her firm, Ganes Consulting. So without further ado, Judy, welcome to the show.
Thank you. And love that introduction, James.
It's so true. It's so easy.
And so, Judy, speaking of introductions, let's start with your introduction to commodities. I love hearing James's story as a little kid growing up in Wisconsin, like starting collecting silver coins, and that was sort of like his gateway into commodities. We always like to have our guests find out, how they stumbled into this world. So would you mind sharing that story with us?
Well, it's interesting because we have a little bit of an overlap there. In high school, I was very entrepreneurial, and it was in the 70s, so when gold and silver were skyrocketing, and I had a jewelry business. And growing up in New York City, I'd find myself at the jewelry exchange, the Diamond Exchange on 47th Street, and I was there speaking to some dealers, and they were talking about the gold and silver market, and they invited me onto the exchange floor. And, at that point, I still wanted to be a dentist. And then I was taken onto the exchange floor, thinking it would be a summer job, and I said, no, this is my career. So
wow,
that was it. So yeah, it started out with the shiny metals, and then I was hired on Wall Street, and after 9/11, hung up my own shingle.
That's pretty cool. James, did you know that story about Judy?
We have even more in common than I even imagined. I was a coin collector in the 70s also. That shiny metal went from $8 an ounce to $50 an ounce. Unlike being a dentist, I was going to be the Green Bay Packers quarterback. However, once silver went from 8 to 50, I said, no, actually, I think trading commodities is going to be my calling. And it has been ever since. So we definitely have that in common.
Cool. And Judy, James found you through your work with Merrill Lynch. Tell us about those early days and working for companies before you set up your own shingle, like you said. What was that world like, being involved in commodities, but essentially answering to someone or working for a major company?
So I started at Payne Weber, and the person who was the head of commodities at that time, manager, was actually a cattle guy. So, he'd wear a suit and his cowboy boots. He was an amazing man. And he'd put his feet up on the desk. And there was a lot of other notable people in that office, legendary traders. Paul Sarnoff, who was also involved with gold and silver options at the time. Jack Schwager was in the research department. And just a lot of legends who James would remember the names. Bernie Saveco. And there was someone who was trading cocoa, who I think now has a bed and breakfast in Vermont. But, it was 1983. And one of my first days, aside from the male stripper that came in for someone's birthday, because let's face it, that was Wall Street back then. There wasn't that Me Too movement. he stood on his cubicle and, uttered a few words I can't say, but it was basically like, that cocoa market, in a heavy German accent. And there's some cowboys in there trading, the softs. And so as part of what I was doing, I worked all through the clearing, cash margins, deliveries, all the back office functions. Had to do everything by hand, no computers. And then I also worked on the exchange floor for 6 months. I got my Series 3, my 7, my 15, my 63, was handed a phone book for Westchester County and a list of airplane pilots as risk takers, and I should dial for dollars and get them to be clients for a 20-year hypothetical performance on a fund that showed a loss. And that's sort of when I went to Shearson.
I need to know why pilots. Why of all the
it's commodities.
But I don't want my pilots to be a risk taker. They shouldn't be risk takers, Judy.
Well,
What
no,
pilots were you
private
calling
pilots,
up?
that was the what I was told. So it was like the Westchester County, New York phone book, and the pilot's license, and kind of go for it.
Wow.
And that wasn't really my thing. So
it doesn't sound like it. And speaking of not your thing, you're describing, for folks not familiar, like if people watch like Wolf of Wall Street, like these wild back rooms, a very guy-centric, testosterone flowing all over the place. Can you explain the difference between the commodities world then as opposed to now in terms of women in the field?
Well, there were a lot more men. I mean, a very high percentage. But I mean, I look back and I say those were fun times. I mean, I don't know how else to describe it, but there was an energy that I think you had because people were like calling the floor, and it was just raw energy and everything sort of at a frenzied pace, and I related to that.
That's so cool. James, did you ever work in that kind of space coming up through the ranks?
I was just going to say that I always picture myself in an office behind hopefully a nice big brown desk with a big brown leather chair. But when I saw that floor for the first time and I heard that buzz going on and this much paper, practically 6 to 12 inches of paper skewing all over the floor at the end of the day, you're walking through it like snow, and you have all these people yelling and screaming and shouting at each other and putting their money where their mouths are. It was so invigorating, and I never wound up working on the floor, but I certainly visited as often as I could. My days working in Chicago, I would often go down to the floor, and the guy said, "Wow, you're down here again." It's like, it's just such a high going down there and seeing what's going on. It was really incredible view.
I would say it was electric.
Yeah.
There is a funny story. One evening, the exchange, and that time it was NYMEX that was hosting a nighttime trading event, and so it was a mock trading, and we were on the floor, and there we were, and it was actually maybe it was a NYMEX and COMEX combined because there was copper prices right next to it. And so we're there on the floor. It was around 7 something p.m. and there was a Reuters tape going across, and it said Scud missiles were, and so we just started trading as if this is like, oh, they put up a false headline, and guess what? It was true. It was like the start of the war, and all of a sudden there was like this dead silence. And they kind of like stopped the mock trading and, told us, okay, like get home safely. But it was like so funny because we just thought it was just part of the how do we react on the mock trading to some world event?
Wow. That's amazing. And speaking of world events, let's talk about major shifts. What are some of the major shifts you've seen over the course of your career? When James Cordier stumbled upon you as to now, what are some of the big game changers in your industry?
As much as things change, some things stay the same. And I tend to think that I have somewhat of an advantage over, I mean, I hate to use the word like youngsters or newcomers to the block because I've seen a lot. And I always say that I've always got to keep learning and I never want to stop learning because at that point, um, it not that it gets boring, but just that maybe, it's time to look at something else. I like lifelong learning and always looking at things from different perspectives. And so, when I look at the market, there was a situation with the coffee market this year. And what do? I go back into, a file that I have and I pulled up a report from, that I wrote in 1985. And I said, look at the correlation here. And this is exactly what's going on. And this is what the market did. And, I tend to remember it without using that. But, I just, for all the little nuances, I went back and I reread what I wrote. And so it was pretty remarkable, sort of how you said, what are the differences? Well, sometimes things stay the same and you can draw from it.
I would just love to add to that because if you're Series 7, you're investing in stocks for your clients, you're going from technology to energy to raw materials, things like this, and it's constantly changing. It might have been Dell computer and like Dell computers, no longer viable. And now it's Apple and it's going on to something else. Now it's AI. Boy, in this industry, coffee is coffee is coffee and it does not change. They grow it in slightly different regions of Brazil and Vietnam, maybe than 20 years ago, but boy, it's the same commodity. And so is orange juice and silver and gold. They really don't change. And it's so interesting that we get to, really hone in on our skill and learning the sugar market or the coffee market. And there's little nuances from time to time, but for the most part, like Judy just said, we're trading the same coffee we were, back in the 80s. And you do get to know it. It's got a personality. And sometimes I think we do have an advantage over some other investors, maybe in some other asset classes.
That's cool. And speaking of coffee, Judy, you mentioned the fact that you fell in love with commodities through diamonds. Can you tell us about the love of coffee? You've been a senior advisor for the Asian Coffee Association. When did coffee become a passion of yours? Because speaking to James, I understand having a variety of skills within this industry and knowing a little bit of everything is very helpful. But tell me about you and coffee.
Well, it's interesting because I cover coffee, cocoa, sugar, cotton, and orange juice. And in my mind, I do them all equally. And it's just that coffee gets a lot of noise because it's a tree crop. It's a little harder to understand. There's always, well, not always, but about once every 10 years, there's some major move in coffee. And more recently, that major move has occurred on a more frequent basis with climate change or climate disruption, whichever way you want to call it. And so it's in the spotlight a bit more. But cocoa certainly had its fun this past year, spiking to all-time highs.
And why do you explain? Can you explain that why?
There was a major shortfall in production in the top 2 producing countries that account for 70% of world output. And I want to add something here of sort of a distinguishing the line of demarcation between some of the markets. So if you look at corn, wheat, soybeans, you put it in the ground, 5 months later, you have a cash crop. And the weather from one season to the next doesn't really impact the supply very much. And so you start afresh. It's a new scratch pad. Okay, what are the S&Ds? And you have your carryover stocks. But when you talk about a tree crop, it's a little different because you have a cumulative effect. So how you fertilize a tree and the weather impacts from one year to the next carry over. And the production on a tree when it's 3 years old is very different when it's 10 years old. And so you have to have a much longer look back period. And so when I look at coffee and cocoa, it's actually a 2-year production cycle, not 1 year. because you have to include that time when the branch was growing and forming the nodes on the branch from which you're going to have the vegetative growth, and then the flowers come. And a lot of people only really start looking at it from the point of flowering. How's the flowering in the Brazilian crop, which is this time of year? But I've been watching the potential, for this coming crop for a year already.
It's interesting. It's like almost being in Napa or in France, viewing the vines and watching grapes and speaking to them and letting them breathe. The tree commodities are so much more interesting than planting corn, and you plant it again and again and again. As Judy mentions, these trees, for example, in coffee, if I'm not mistaken, they're producing for 8 and 10 and 12 years. And their production this year has something to do with, what the weather was 4 years ago and 6 years ago, and were they pruned, and was there a lot of fertilization used then? Was it really dry or cold that year? It's really getting to know, these commodities, these 3 or 4 that we're referring to, almost on a namely basis. You get to know them. They have a personality. It's kind of like a fine wine and Napa, except it's growing coffee, oranges, and sugar and cocoa in a different hemisphere.
So cool. And Judy, we mentioned Asia, and for the uninitiated, it'd be like, wait, they're making coffee in Asia? I know it's down in South. I know all these legendary brands that come from South America. I've seen them in my stores. Tell me about the role of Asia in the coffee market.
Sure. So Asia is actually a very large producer of mostly Robusta coffee. So you have Arabica and you have Robusta. And so if you map it out, so Arabica, most is grown within the tropics, first off. And so it gets you to travel to a lot of beautiful, exotic, lovely countries with, great cultural heritage. And so that has been an amazing aspect of my career also, is getting to meet thousands of people from all over. But what happens is Arabica is grown in South America, Central America, and then East Africa. And there are some countries that produce both Robusta and Arabica. India is one of them, Indonesia, Uganda, but there's always a dominant. So whether you're a largely Arabica producer or largely a Robusta producer. Back in the 1990s, the World Bank made a decision to try and help Vietnam. And Vietnam was producing Robusta coffee and a little bit of Arabica for a century, 1 million bags. And the World Bank, there was a change. Let me back up. There was a change in the regulations, the laws for ownership for owning agricultural lands. So instead of it being a long-term lease, the farmers could own their land. So they had the incentive then to grow more coffee. And so Vietnam, out of nowhere, went from 1 million to 15 million to 30 million bags of coffee and became the second largest coffee producer in the world and the largest Robusta supplier.
Wow, that's amazing. It's so crazy. James, how do people learn about this stuff? Because this is all very mind-blowing to me as someone not involved in the commodities industry, but how do most folks even know that Vietnam all of a sudden has regulations that all of a sudden these farmers have? How do people find out about this stuff, James?
Oh my God. Can I say this? You just subscribe to my reports. I'm sorry, I had to get that in there.
If you were going to say that, I was going to. So growing up, just watching TV, watching the commercials, and there was a gentleman named Juan Valdez, and he was talking about, and supposedly he's on a beautiful animal in the mountains of Colombia, and Colombia coffee was the richest kind. And at the time, Colombia was a huge producer of Arabica coffee, maybe 10 or 12 million bags. And Brazil, kind of like Vietnam at the time when they were just starting out, Colombia was the largest producer of Arabica coffee. Then all of a sudden, years later, Brazil is producing 10 million bags, and then 20 million bags, and 30 million bags, and 40 million bags, and 50 million bags. And you're just following the commodity. You're just, researching it the best you can. And now, Brazil is 5 times the size of Colombia. So it's kind of quite a transition for following where the money leads, and that is, raising these commodities that people can't do without. Coffee, cocoa, sugar, those are 3 good examples.
By the way, the longtime actor who played the role of Juan Valdez, passed away a year or two ago. He's really a lovely man. I met him multiple times over the years at, conventions, events in Colombia, but sadly he passed away. But there was a funny story related to that. And Costa Rica, one time found a coffee farmer named Juan Valdez, and they published these bumper stickers that Juan Valdez drinks only Costa Rican coffee, which sort of upset the Colombian Coffee Federation. But, for us standing on the outside, it was pretty amusing, and they distributed them at a conference in Costa Rica.
Oh, that's funny. And maybe you guys can explain it because I can't. Growing up, coffee was sort of like a dessert delicacy. Like my parents drank it after dinner, or if we went to a restaurant, if we wanted a piece of pie or cake, let's have some coffee with it. And then all of a sudden, as I'm growing up, there's a coffee shop like on every corner in America. So this is a really random open question, but do either of you have any idea why this became a thing? Because again, when I was a kid, if you want a cup of coffee, you went to a diner. And me growing up in New Jersey, there were plenty of diners, but like, where did other people go for coffee? Where did this obsession with coffee come from, and how did that affect the commodities market?
I would suggest it's based on convenience and, the different working day schedule. I think you're right. Coffee would be for, the morning. And then I think work days started getting longer, and there was more, things required by employees at different locations said, it's 12:30, it's 1 o'clock. I still have 4 hours to, my 4 hour shift is still going on. Could go really for a cup of coffee. And I think that's how it all started myself, as people working outside the home, and of course, both sexes working outside of the home. And all of a sudden, coffee just wasn't, for 1 cup in the morning or at the diner after dinner. It was throughout the day. I think just more requirements for people to be sharp and alert and working as hard as they can. And certainly coffee can help you with that.
Well, I'll add some color and switch that up a little bit, because like my father drank maybe 7 cups a day. So, I mean, it depends on it. It's very generational. So the generation before your parents, okay, drank a huge amount of coffee. I mean, it was just like a constant. But remember also when they were drinking coffee, they would make maybe a pot, a percolator on the stove. And then in offices, you had like the Bunomatic machine, and it was, like a 10-pot machine. And so there was a lot of waste. The kitchen sink was probably the biggest consumer.
Wow.
Okay. And then you start getting single serve appliances and making coffee more convenient, pods, capsules. And so from that perspective, there was a lot more efficiency. And if you're a farmer, you're growing coffee by the bag. You're not selling it by the cup. And so that transition period became a little bit of a problem, a hiccup in terms of the demand scenario. And it was happening at the same time that there was the birth of the specialty coffee movement. And that started really in the late 1990s, early 2000s, where it, totally took off, and you had conferences and, expos all devoted to specialty coffee. But it also corresponded with a couple of market features. In 2000, the coffee market was extremely depressed. And there was an abundant oversupply, and coffee producers were sort of set up and saying, we can't live on these low prices. And rather than beholden to coffee as a commodity, we're going to try and differentiate and get a premium through quality. And so you had Central America suddenly growing better coffee. And if you have the better cup of coffee and it's marketed as such, then consumers are going to pay attention to that. And you had the Starbucks phenomenon. And so that all added to it. And so you had the, explosion of coffee houses dominating, as opposed to people taking, that commercial coffee vendor office supply coffee that we had in the 1980s.
That's great. I remember as an 80s kid, the Folgers, a can, and the Sanka. That was the go-to in my house because my parents didn't want to go through all this other effort that people were going through because the Keurig machine wasn't around then. So I get that. And speaking of things that aren't around, earlier, Judy, you mentioned an ancient artifact called the phone book and the telephone. Many young viewers or listeners of this may not know what a phone book is. Maybe it's the app on their phone that tells them the phones of their friends. But let's talk about technology in the world that you play in. How incredible has technology played a role in commodities?
Oh, let me look at my Rolodex.
Another one. Yes.
Right? Like what's a Rolodex? And
Yeah.
you look up everybody's numbers or what's a hold button? I mean, I'll admit this. When I first started out in the 1980s, I was hired as a senior analyst when I was in my early 20s because they let someone else go and, I was like cheap and filled quota. And so, I had big shoes to fill. And so someone would call me up and James, I don't think I did this to you because I met you a little later on. Okay. But like someone would ask me a question and if I didn't know it, I couldn't Google it. So I had to use my wits and I'd say, you know what, I'm on another call. Can I call you back? And then I would like go through my Rolodex and find someone who could give me the proper explanation, or I'd find 2 or 3 people and determine what is the correct one and get the full story. And that's how I learned. It was like trial by fire. And when I first started out, we didn't have computers.
I remember trading silver, one of my first commodities that I started following. And I remember taking graph paper and lining it tail to tail to tail, graphing the price of silver using pencil and paper and rulers to draw trend lines. So stochastics and Bollinger Bands, RSIs really weren't available, but we were just drawing channels. And we were learning about head and shoulders tops and
Right.
W bottoms and W tops. I was involved with it way before just pushing a couple buttons and having all the information spit out to you. Perhaps that's why Judy and I have a fundamental knowledge of these markets, because you didn't have any choice. And perhaps that's why it comes maybe not only easier to us, but it's kind of a passion for us.
Well, did you get the CRB weekly booklets?
Yes.
Right. And then, so the CRB, Commodity Research Bureau, used to send out these booklets with all the charts in
Right.
the graphs. And so you would have, little, grids on it and okay, I'm a fundamentalist, but, closet technician also, right? And so you'd fill in whatever patterns you were doing. And then if during the week it broke above or below the y-axis, like, oh no, what do you do? And this is where you staple or you tape additional pages on. And I would say that most offices had these big graphs hanging up on your wall. And I remember when coffee broke a buck, right? And so what do? We like traced it onto the wall. And we were just adding the paper. And then we were just writing it on the wall. Like, oh, okay, there's coffee going down and down and down. And, the same way on the upside. And then, so we're creative.
I remember those booklets oh so well. I think you receive them once or twice a month, like perhaps every 2 weeks. And from time to time, the price is off the page and you just have to compromise and figure out how to do that. But I was actually using graph paper before these booklets. Those books were like, oh my gosh, this is great. I only have to keep the data for 2 weeks. Then it comes brand new to me again, shortly in the mail. And I always enjoyed looking forward to getting the new books because now all the print and the charts are perfect. At least for 2 weeks they
I would admit yours were just as perfect.
were. Too kind.
So, Judy, earlier you mentioned the youngsters. So if a youngster pops on this podcast and has to look up all these things that you're talking about because they don't know what it is, but let's talk about what people that are coming new into this industry, regardless of age, what are some of the common mistakes you're seeing that are different now than you saw earlier in your career? Or maybe they're the same issues you see with a lot of people jumping into this industry.
Well, I think that part of it is longevity and not being short-term focused only. Okay. That if data is published, okay, so suppose the Brazilian Coffee Exporters Association releases data monthly, and it has the data for Brazilian coffee exports, and it shows this month versus last month. Well, to me, that's not really relevant because it's not looking at a seasonal flow. It's not giving you the historic comparison to even last year. You want to take a much longer approach to the market and then zero in because it could be very misleading. So if last year the shipments were very low, unusually low, and this year they're back to normal, it looks like there's a big increase. But did they really increase? No. And so you want to look at seasonals, you want to look at the monthly, the monthly patterns, annual, you want to compare on a cumulative basis. And, before we could use apps, I input it all manually. Daily data came out and I had to keep on top of it. I wouldn't leave for the day or, close up unless I input all the data that I needed to. And in doing that, you remember it. So ask me what Cuban production sugar was in whatever year. And it's like you build a steel trap memory of all these facts and figures that, most people think are useless, but they clog my brain.
At my firm, we do write about 10 different commodities. And it's amazing the fact that if you're writing about them, you're researching, that commodity, and nothing really escapes you too much because you're constantly following the current fundamentals, what the trends might be, what the seasonality might be. As Judy mentions, we're large into seasonality, not month to month, because we're talking about commodities that generally, with the exception of gold and silver, are growing in the ground. When we refer to energy prices, we always refer to versus the 5-year average so that we have, some data to go back on and, set the trend for them. I like the idea of, following these markets so closely that like a steel trap, you actually know, what the different production figures are and what the trends are for demand coming up, what time of the year. Quite often, as simple as this, you're buying gasoline prices in January because they're going to likely rally in driving season. You're buying heating oil in the summer, it's likely going to rally for, winter season. And the other three commodities are, quite similar that way. And the more you write about them, the more you get to know them, and you don't miss too many items when you're doing it that closely.
And we hope we don't. But, there's always new factors. So look at what happened in terms of the pandemic and logistical supply disruptions and the dislocation of containers and now the war and longer lead times. So when you think about, say looking back at the cocoa market, how much time do you think a manufacturer needs to put Christmas candy in a supermarket, on the supermarket shelves? When is that cocoa grown? When is it purchased? When is it contracted for? When is the cocoa ground? When is the promotions made for that to know the quantities? And the lead time is enormous.
And on that subject of history and trends and forecasting, has there been a time, Judy, where maybe your market analysis went completely against consensus or what has been seen in the past, and you were proven right? Was there an issue where you were reading between the tea leaves, or reading tea leaves, reading between the lines, that you saw something that maybe trends and forecasting hadn't planned for?
Yeah, and I was told to wear a bulletproof vest, and I was told never to step foot in a producer country again. There's an interesting story with a fund manager. So when I was at Merrill, we used to be paraded in front of a large hedge fund, and they talk about the other markets, and then they came around to kind of like the soft commodities, and I told this large hedge fund manager at the time, I said, well, I think coffee is a table banger. And, if you have a grandmother, I'd sell her and buy coffee. And that was like my analogy. Why I said that, I don't know. But I remember saying that. And they were distinctly bearish on the market. And then I was quoted on Reuters or Commodity News Services saying the coffee market was going to $2. I was trading at $1.25 at the time. This was last quarter, 1996. And I was believing that because I was seeing the export numbers coming down and deliverable stocks going lower and lower and lower. They weren't at a point of inflection or panic yet in the market. And then that January 1997, mid-January, the market started to explode. Now, for those listening, to put into perspective, the coffee market is 37,500 pounds as one contract. So a 1 cent move or 100 points is $375. And the market was trading at $1.25 per pound. And by May, so 4 months later, exploded to $3.18 a pound. It was a massive, massive move in the coffee market. And remember, I predicted, a month, before the market started moving, that was going to $2. And this hedge fund manager called me up and said, you were really wrong on the market because it went to $3, not $2. I was like, so you can't win. It's not just the price move, but sometimes the timing is just as important. I mean, James knows that you could be right on a market, but if your timing is off, then you might as well just be mud.
Judy, don't you feel that if you can just take some of the timing matter out of it, trade a little bit more longer term, that brilliant call that you made would have been suffice even for that guy who thought you did it wrong because it went to $3 and not $2. But timing is so difficult in this industry. If you can take a longer term approach to it, 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, it's so much easier, and you should maybe structure your trading or your investing that way. I have a similar story. It was in crude oil and not in coffee, but I remember crude oil was reaching $100 a barrel, on its way to 150, and all the pundits thought that crude oil would never reach over $100. It was just trading at 20 or 25 recently, and as it turned out, I was invited on Fox Business with Neil Cavuto, and oil was approaching $150 a barrel. And the reason why it was going up continually and basically having all the experts be wrong is because China just recently had millions of cars on the street instead of bicycles. And what China wanted to do was get into the automobile industry. So what they did is they kept their thumb pushed down on energy prices locally, domestically in China. So while the prices were going up around the world, the new drivers in China didn't experience the increase. So you have all this new demand for gasoline and other energy products. And the fact that oil was going up, it never curbed demand in the new, largest consumption country in the world. And all of a sudden, when oil hit 145, 150, I just happened to be on Fox Business with Neil, and I just realized that China was about to take the subsidies off of the price of gasoline. So all of a sudden, these new drivers in China were about to get the sticker shock of where gasoline really is on a world basis. And I said, Neil, the price of oil is about to top out here at 150. And I think it's going to go down to around, the double digits, 60, 70, $80. And by gosh, a week later, the market was falling. It was well under $100. And we really took an opposite position of everybody in the market. And we got that one right.
Wow, that's a great story. All right, so Judy, we talked about the past, the present. Let's look forward. As we wrap things up, talking about the future, what excites you about this industry, whether it's a particular commodity, whether it's a technology? What are you bullish on going for 2025 and beyond?
Okay. Well, first off, I'm really excited about technology and harnessing and leveraging technology. And I sort of see it as me on steroids. So that's one aspect, but that's a personal goal for my business, and using technology to take everything that I've done by hand, painstakingly inputting data, and then using that as, using computers to come up with some signals and algorithms, and see what I could find as far as fine tuning what I do now. So from personal quest, and I even took a course last year at MIT on no code machine learning. And so that's kind of my baby right now.
Okay. And how about in the world of commodities? Anything you're excited about?
Well, I just came back from traipsing around Brazil, some coffee farms. And here's a situation where a couple of weeks ago, the internet was flooded with these beautiful, beautiful photos of the trees flowering with what will become the 25-26 crop. And so I went to Brazil, and not only did I not see the beautiful flowering, but there was hardly any remnants of it. It was pretty much a failed flowering. The trees were so stressed by drought for 6-7 months. Some areas did not have any rain, above average temperatures. And James knows I've been writing about this for a while, that there could be some problems with this tree crop as a result of the past weather. And so there was one view of the market in 25-26 would kind of like come in and save the day. And I spent 10 days going to dozens of coffee farms, and trees that were irrigated looked okay, not great. There was a lot of farmers that saying, we're not going to have enough crop to pay for harvesting. In Brazil, it's mechanized harvesting mostly. And to put a machine down the row of trees costs the same whether that machine is harvesting a full crop or nothing. There's diesel involved, and the rental of equipment, and they can't afford to do it. And so they were chopping down trees. It's called skeletonizing and stumping the trees, which is very late. And so I'm looking at it as, okay, well, we've got another problem on our hands. My year is going to be pretty interesting.
Wow.
What we're seeing right now, for the first time, me being in the industry for decades, is high net worth individuals are actually looking at commodities, for what we're seeing, for the first time. Everyone is invested in real estate and in stocks, and a lot of people have been thinking about, maybe I should have a third asset class. And I think cocoa going to all-time highs. I think the option trading going on in commodities right now, gold hitting all-time highs recently, Robusta coffee hitting all-time highs recently. A lot of people, for the first time, are considering commodities as an asset class, for their portfolios. And option trading on commodities is just blowing up. So that is the industry that we're in. That's our niche, is options on commodities. And for the first time, high net worth individuals, I think, are looking for a third asset class. What happens in the stock market and in real estate, they all go up together and then they all come down together. So if you have to shore up your stock portfolio with real estate, or your real estate with your stock portfolio, you're just selling at the worst time. So having a third asset class, for the first time in decades that I can see, a lot of individuals are getting involved with that. And we're looking forward to facilitating those investment ideas for them.
I would agree. I mean, that there is a cyclical pattern to trading commodities where sort of, um, you know, part of it is the weather, part of it is economic cycles and demand pushes. I mean, remember when everyone was talking about China and the demand that was going to increase and everything was going to get really expensive because every person in China, every Chinaman was going to have like a new pair of socks and boxers, and so the cotton market was going to explode, and so there's a lot of that. And then all of a sudden you have a downturn, and so commodities tend to have bigger stocks and more depressed prices. I mean, James, what we didn't talk about in the past was also regulated markets. So
Right.
so there used to be similar to OPEC. So you had, as a result of the high prices in the 70s, there was sort of a tide turn to let's regulate commodities and let's have buffer stocks and let's have gentlemen's agreements and keep prices of coffee between $1.20 and $1.40 because that's what's best for producers and consumers. And then one by one, they all fell apart in the late 1980s. A flood of coffee and sugar and cocoa and whatever hit the markets and then caused the very depressed prices. And so that became the down cycle in commodities. And it took, sort of a decade and some weather issues to work through it. And so you have these big swings over a decade or 2 decades where some hand that intervened, then suddenly the winds change. And interest rates are part of that also. So talk about what's going to be negotiated next. In the US, the 2018 foreign policy, we didn't talk about EUDR and, the European deforestation regulations. That's going to be a game changer for some and create some issues and trade flow problems. It's a disruptor.
It is.
That's awesome. Well, Judy, it's been a blast. For folks who don't have your contact information in their Rolodex, what would be the best place to get a hold of you, find out more about you, Judy?
Oh, you could just Google Judy Coffee Analyst, 3-word search, and I come up at top.
Awesome. Judy, thanks so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Oh, it was a pleasure.